or listening to me, I'm grateful that you chose me. I really am. And I hope I kind of live up to the standards that were set in that kind of introduction by Fiona. There's nothing worse than when the bar is always set really high for you. I want to talk to you for about half an hour. And I want to talk to you about a really timely and kind of relevant subject. I want to talk about what we've all been through over the last 12 months of this weird, wacky, wonderful world and this pandemic that we've lived through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to talk through some slides. As Fiona said, put questions in the chat as I run through the presentation. At the end of it, I'm around to answer any questions that you may have. If you want to wait till the end, fine by me. But if you do want to put them in the chat, then please do. So I'm just going to hit share screen, and give me a sec. It's quite interesting. Hopefully, if I do this, Fiona, maybe you can tell me. Can you see that? Cool, cool, cool. Except I've started at the very end. What you should do is when you're doing stuff like this is start at the very beginning. It really does help the narrative. So I want to talk about being human during times of uncertainty, right? It's obvious, you can read the slide. Now, in order to do that, what I want to do is I want to kind of look at three aspects of the last 12 months. I want us to, first off, reflect on what we've been through. And me and colleagues of mine who work within the behavioral science world, we'll all agree that we've all been through a kind of a global trauma. We may not think it is, but actually the categorization that a psychologist would give what we've been through would be a trauma. So I want us to reflect on where we've been. Then I want us to look at that kind of situation and explore what we may have learned from that. And then kind of use that learning to figure out what we can do going forward as we exit what we've been through over the last 12 months. Now, I'm going to ask a massive favor of you. I would like you for the next kind of 30 minutes to be nothing but selfish. I want you to think about everything I'm saying in the context and how it relates to you and nobody else but you. I want, every time I say, this is what we've done and this is what we've been through, I want you to think, how have I been through this? How did I cope? What did I think? And just think about you for a moment, hence the line at the bottom. I want you to listen to this through the lens of introspection and self-awareness. So the first part of this talk is to reflect on where we've been over the last 12 months. Now, I am happy to admit this. I'm a proper film buff. I love my films. I love great TV, especially TV series. And one of the TV series that I binge watched was on Netflix, and it was Stranger Things. I'm sure many of you on this call had watched Stranger Things on Netflix. Now, why do I mention Stranger Things? Because actually, if we're trying to think of a comparison, an analogy to talk about what's happened to us over the last 12 months, the entire plot of Stranger Things is actually really relevant. And for those who don't know about Stranger Things, basically there's a town called Hawkins, and in Hawkins, underneath Hawkins, is a parallel universe called the Upside Down. And it's almost like a mirror image of the world above, except in the Upside Down is this dark, horrible creature called the Demogorgon, who just wreaks havoc on the population of Hawkins. And when I've been thinking about what we've been through, it really is kind of like we've gone from this beautiful, tranquil, kind of idyllic 80s town of Hawkins, and we've been thrust into the Upside Down. We've been put into this place where we kind of recognize it, but maybe we don't. And there's this dark, kind of hideous shadow always by our side that we have to deal with, that's kind of wreaking havoc across the land. And the question is, how do you get out of the Upside Down? How do you get back to the place that you recognize? It's really, really difficult, especially when we are being bombarded with tons upon tons of information all the time. And the way that we kind of navigate the Upside Down, the way that we process all of this information that's been thrown at us, is by simply using two systems, two psychological systems. And those two systems, as you can probably tell from the image, are our hearts and our minds. Or if we use proper psychology language, our affective system, which is our emotional system, and our cognitive system, it's our brains. Now, I say that's our brains as if the affective system isn't part of our brain. Of course it is. But what I mean by that is the way we process information, because our affective system is where we make decisions that are dominated by how we feel at the time. Are we stressed? Are we angry? Are we upset? Are we scared? Those feelings, those emotions drive the decisions that we make. Our cognitive system is where we make decisions based on how we process information. Now, it shouldn't be too much of a leap of faith to realize that of the two systems, our affective and cognitive system, our affective system is by far the most dominant. It is so powerful that it's often really hard to get past our emotional state in order to make a clear-headed decision. Clear-headed, of course, in inverted commas there. Now, the thing is with these two systems is that they are in kind of constant interplay with each other. So, for example, you may read something and misinterpret what you're reading, and that triggers an emotional feeling in you, that may be anger or disgust or joy, euphoria, whatever it is. Your misinterpretation of information has triggered your affective system, and therefore that would cloud your judgment going forward. Or equally, you could be in a highly emotional state and you're trying to process information, but because you're in an emotional state, you kind of can't see the wood for the trees. And therefore you can't process it properly because your affective system is kind of being too dominant, if you like. And there's a great deal of study around these two systems and their interplay. And it's kind of categorized by psychologists as what's known as the cognitive affective processing system, or CAPS. And what this kind of theory tells us is that if you want to understand you and how you will behave, then what you need to do is you need to know two things. You need to understand you at a deep level, a real high kind of self-awareness level. And you need to understand how you deal with a situation. When you understand those two things, you can kind of funnel that down to a list of behaviors that are more likely to manifest themselves during a given time or a given situation. But actually, it goes more than that. And that's which is relevant to this talk. What it tells us is it kind of gives us a framework for spotting whether our affective system is actually being dominant. So when we're making a decision, you become aware of the fact that actually it's quite emotionally driven, or I'm being emotionally led. Why do I feel like this? And the cognitive affective processing system gives us a framework in order to do that, as well as listing out a whole range of emotions that we could be and should be aware of. And they categorize them in kind of two rudimentary groups. And I don't mind telling you this, I hate this classification of emotion because it kind of makes emotions sound as if they're just black and white. And they are far from black and white. They are multicolored beyond belief. But let's go with it just to kind of make the point here. So what they kind of tell us is that on one side, you could have those negative emotions, despondency, capitulation, denial and fear. But on the other hand, you could have a series of positive emotions such as optimism and thrill and euphoria, opportunity. Now, if we reflect back over the last 12 months, there's been moments of time where we've been maybe watching a Boris Johnson or a Nicola Sturgeon talk on TV, and they've said a sentence that has filled us with optimism. And all of a sudden we're like, oh my goodness, we're coming out of this thing. And then they follow it with a killer punchline that kind of just sends you back into a state of despondency again. And this roller coaster of emotion is really, really challenging for us as a species. We don't cope very well with our kind of affective system and our cognitive systems being turned on and off that quickly, because there is a psychological kind of burden, but there's also a physiological burden. Our bodies bear the brunt. And you only need to look at research on stress and its impacts, its long-term impact on our overall health to understand that these emotional roller coasters are not the best place for human beings to be in. Of course, a bit of stress is good and a bit of negative emotion is good because it kind of gives us the kick up the backside we often need sometimes. But when it's overloaded, it becomes a real challenge for us. And if you kind of think of this as kind of batteries with power, we all kind of have moments in time when there's certain aspects of us where we are absolutely running on empty. We've got nothing left. You know, we can't see anything that is showing us optimism. We can't see anything that gives us hope. And actually, all we can see is despondency and uncertainty. But the thing about human beings, and why I've studied human behavior for so long, why I love talking about human behavior, is that whilst this is true generally, the reality is every single one of us is unique. Every single one of us faces the world and navigates the world in our own unique way. There isn't a right or wrong. There isn't a good or bad. There's just us trying to do the best with the kind of the hand that nature has dealt us. And sometimes I tell people at talks around the world, you know, you've got to stop beating yourself up, thinking that a behavior is bad or good. You know, nobody wakes up on a morning and says, I think I'll make a bad decision today. We don't do that, right? We don't do that. We wake up and we tackle the world head on, trying to do our best. Sometimes that turns out bad, sometimes it turns out good. And when we kind of think in that context and we look back at how we have navigated the last 12 months, it gives us an opportunity to explore what we may have learned from that. And I don't know about you, but for me, I've learned a ton over the last 12 months, in particular about me. You know, I've changed jobs in the last 12 months. I've focused my attention somewhere else in the last 12 months because I had time to do this introspection, to sit down and think, this isn't what I want to do. So I've taken some great positives from the lockdown, especially being kind of locked at home for the period of time that we have. But when I do my analysis and when I do my look back, I can't help but know that when I look back at my kind of the last 12 months, and I'm trying to recall memories, those two systems I talked about, my affective system and my cognitive system, also kind of play their part. Not necessarily in the way I decide, but in the way that it presents biased thinking to me. Now, we all have behavioral bias, right? We all have bias that kind of makes us judgmental. We may stereotype people, but equally when we're making decisions and we're trying to navigate a noisy 21st century world, we bring to the party behavioral bias. Affective bias, as you probably have guessed, are biases that we have that are emotionally driven. Cognitive bias are where we have a bias that is driven by the way we process information. Exactly the same terminology. Now, if we look back at the last 12 months, there are a handful of behavioral biases that play their part in how we process information. But one of them will be dominant. And that bias is the hindsight bias. It's a really well-researched behavioral bias, and it kind of can be triggered by our affective system, or it can be triggered by our cognitive system. Now, let me just quickly tell you about hindsight bias, just to give you the context, to tell you why it's such a nuisance. It's a real pain in the backside. When we look back at an event that has happened, we tend to, without realizing it, this is unconscious, we apply filters to that information. And hindsight bias is one of those filters. And what we do is we can tend to apply one of three types of hindsight bias. So we can either look back at what's gone on and we can apply with hindsight bias a memory distortion. And what I mean by that is you can look back at what's gone on during the pandemic and you kind of look at a particular event and how an event played out. And you may say something along the lines of, I said that would happen. Anybody who says that to you is suffering with hindsight bias. I said that would happen. You know, did you? Who did you say it to? Because you didn't say it to me. You know, and how on earth could you have known at the time when everything that we were going through was new to everybody? So if you say, I said that would happen, you instantly give yourself an excuse not to learn. The second level of hindsight bias, which I think is probably one of the most dominant, is the aspect of inevitability. And that's where we look back at what we've been through over the last 12 months and we say something like, it had to happen. You know, oh yeah, we went into a second lockdown. It had to happen because. Well, no, we didn't know it had to happen at all because we were all going through the same thing every single day, learning. And then the final level of hindsight bias is where we kind of believe that we can predict. And we look back and we say, I knew that would happen. And it's probably the most dominant out of all three, actually. I know I said the middle one is quite powerful, but the top one, you hear a lot of people saying, I knew that would happen. There's one of my, I do a podcast called the Bite-Sized Behaviour Podcast, and I did an episode on hindsight bias. And I used a situation which I said wasn't real, and you can decide whether it was real or not. But I was in the car with my wife and hit this junction, and it was is it left or right? I'm going left. I choose. I go left. We go left. Several miles down the road, it clearly wasn't left. It was right. And of course, my wife, who I adore, turns to me and says, I told you we should have gone right. I knew we should have gone right. So how did you know? You're picking on someone who understands hindsight bias. But how did you know? Where's your evidence to say you knew it was right? And I say that in a flippant way, right? But my point is, we can often apply these kind of distortions, these predictions, these inevitabilities to what has gone on before. And what they do, as I've just said, is they prevent us from learning. When we look back at what we've been through over the last 12 months, we need to look back with absolute, utter honesty and say, what did I do well? What did I not do well? If that situation arose again, what could I do better? If I did something well, how can I transfer that skill to my future life? Because I think I dealt with that pretty well, actually. That's a great thing for me to have learned about myself. But if we try and find excuses through things like hindsight bias, we'll never learn. We will never, ever learn. And excuse me. And the thing is with hindsight bias is it plays to our memories. Now, I could talk to you, maybe I will one day. I could talk to you for hours about this one subject. This one slide is a talk in itself. And it's the subject of how we look back and we use our memory recall to tell us what has gone on. Now, there is a great book. There's a great book by Dr. Julia Shaw called The Memory Illusion. I highly recommend you read this book, by the way. I'm not associated or affiliated with it. It's just an amazing book. And what Julia says is, when we recall a memory, what we do is we kind of encode the memory, but we can't encode every single detail of it. Of course we can't. What we do is we take the salient parts and we encode them. Then, because we are storytelling creatures, when we recall the memory, we recall those salient parts, which are full of gaps, and we create a narrative that bridges the salient parts. In other words, when we recall a memory, we pretty much make it up. Now, we don't think like that because the memory feels visceral, it feels real. It's, no, that's my memory. I'm not making it up. But the reality is our brain hasn't got the capacity to store every memory in full HD quality, frame by frame. It takes the snapshot of the powerful bits and keeps them. Everything else, it bins. And so when we look back at what we've been through over the last 12 months, and we have to recall memories, we need to be cognizant of the fact that they are snapshots. They aren't a full word-by-word account of everything that's gone on. So that and hindsight bias are playing against us, looking back to learn. But if you're conscious of these two things, you can look back through the lens of honesty and you can go, no, I'm going to learn. I'm going to learn what I did well, and I'm going to look at what I could do better going forward. By the way, before I move off the slide, just a slight digression, if you give me permission. Julia Shaw does this thing, which is the scariest thing I've read in social science. And she talks about how it was really difficult to get approval to do this. She had to go through a lengthy approval process with universities to do what she did. She basically found the parents of 5 students who authorized this research to be done. And she took 5 students, and over the course of 4 or 5 months, she planted false memories in their heads. She's told them that they'd done something as a kid that she made up. And then when these students would say to their parents, this woman said that you told them I did this, the parents would go, yes, that's true, you did. And the parents would reinforce the false memory. And after 5, 6, 7 weeks, when she then interviewed them, that false memory had become so powerful in their head that they couldn't no longer distinguish whether it was true or false. And the reason she does this is to prove that eyewitness accounts in court can't be counted on, because memories can be tampered with. and they are typically false. Anyway, I'm going to go off on a complete tangent, so I'm going to stop. The book's amazing. Right? Read the book. Trust me, you will learn something about yourself if, of course, you're willing to learn and you're willing to go on that journey of self-discovery. So that's where we've been. Yes, we can give ourselves a framework to learn. And once we do that, we can absolutely prepare ourselves for whatever lies ahead, whether that's the road to complete freedom, whether we can go back to the pubs and restaurants and visit our friends without worrying about stuff, or whether something similar comes along in 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years' time, whatever it is. We've just been through a unique global trauma together. Everybody on the planet has experienced the same thing. Therefore, that gives us a superhuman strength, of superhuman power of empathy. We can empathize with every other human being because we've all been through it at the same time. And that's a powerful thing to think of as we go through and plan for how we can deal with what we do going forward. Now, as we entered this, especially 2021, I would argue that we entered it with mixed feelings. Because we knew a vaccine was coming, we entered it with optimism. If everybody gets vaccinated, then we can all get back to, inverted commas, normality. But equally, because we feel like we've been burned before, we've come out of a lockdown, we've gone back in, we've come out, we've gone back in, that plays on our mind. So also we enter a case of feeling a little bit uncertain. These two emotions are like this. You've got optimism and uncertainty fighting for your attention. And that kind of plays a heavy toll on you as a human being. But, and there's a big but, and there's a reason why I put this slide in here. Remember my slide of the emotions, and I said to you, I've never liked the fact that they're categorized as good or bad because emotions are technicolored. Well, actually, words like uncertainty are often painted as a negative emotion, but there's a truth about uncertainty. And if you kind of all have teams of people, or you work with other people, and you go into a room to do some brainstorming, and you say to people, right, we need to come up with a really cool idea for a new product, whatever it is. And what I want you all to do is, I don't want you to think about what we could do now. I want you to think outside the box. I want you to really kind of think weird and wacky. What you are asking people to do is enter their heads into a state of uncertainty. That's what you're asking people to do. And because that's what uncertainty is. It kind of, if people say, I need you to think outside the box. Well, when we are in times of uncertainty, we're already outside the box. And there's a ton of research in social psychology that shows you when you put a human into a state of uncertainty, they become the most innovative, adaptive, and creative they can ever be. Because it's strange and we don't want to be there. We want to be in a state of certainty. So we come up with novel ways to get to a place of certainty. And it's in those novel ways of taking ourselves from uncertain to certain that some of the world's best inventions have happened. You just need to think about when you've come up with an idea, that's been an amazing idea. It will have elements to varying degrees of uncertainty kind of running through it. So we shouldn't embrace certain or categorize or stereotype certain emotions. We should just accept that we are multicolored from an emotional perspective. Sometimes those emotions are good. They keep us alive. They keep us alert. Sometimes they can be overwhelming and they can bring us down. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that these emotions can be used and abused in different ways, shapes, and forms. And we just need to be conscious of that. But one of the things that we absolutely should be looking to do, and this again is borne out in a ton of research, is getting to a place where we can all start to feel like our emotions are in check, like our cognitive affective processing system isn't in overdrive anymore. And one of the things that we absolutely know, or one of the environments we know that will absolutely happen, is when we get back to a human to human situation again, when we can be in the same room as other people, when we can not worry about the fact that I'm a meter closer to someone than I was 6 months ago, when I can sit around a boardroom table with my friends and my colleagues and share my experiences. Because as humans, we've spent 5.5 million years evolving to be the creatures that we are today. And those 5.5 million years have given us some amazing lessons. We can look at another human being in front of us And without them saying a word, we know that they're not okay. We just know there's something not right. Or they may say something and we just know there's something off about them. That's because we've spent 5 million years evolving in kind of tribes. You know, we understand other humans intimately because obviously we are one. So we need to get back to a place as quickly and as safely as we can, obviously, where we can be in the connecting again with other human beings, because it's in those environments that we thrive. And again, there is research coming out of my ears that shows that a human-to-human environment and environments where the human is removed from another human, and you can show which one thrives and which one suffers. And the one that suffers is the one where human-to-human contact is significantly limited. So it's always been one of my concerns during the pandemic, this lack of social connectivity. And I don't mean social as in Facebook, I mean as in physical connectivity. And you will all know this. You'll have spent months in your own little bubbles with your own family and in your house. And then the second you meet another human being, even if it's for a walk in the park, it's like you've won the lottery. It's like, oh my God, this feels amazing. And I remember, and I don't mind sharing this story with you. I'm in the middle of moving house. So we're currently living with my in-laws, two mid-80-year-old Italians. And they hadn't seen another human being really for like 7 months. And then we took a coronavirus test, which was fine. And we decided, let's move in here for 6 weeks and then we'll move on. And when we came here, my mother-in-law offered me her elbow and I said to her, you don't need to do that anymore. And she hugged me. And it was in that moment of hugging another human being, you realize what you take for granted. And just that feeling of euphoria, of feeling relaxed, of feeling loved. You kind of go, this is what life is about, these connections. And the fact that they've been ripped apart, or we've all been ripped apart for too long, isn't a good thing. So the sooner we can kind of get back together again, the better, in my view. So if we move forward, what do we need to do, and what kind of steps do we need to take in order for us to make sure that as we move forward, we will absolutely reap the benefits of whatever the transition is? Well, there's a few tips. And the first tip is kind of like the bleeding obvious, right? You should start out with the right set of attitudes. You should start from a place of positivity. If we exit the pandemic and your first thought is, oh, we're going to go back into lockdown, it's not a great mental place to start from. So even if that does become the reality, we need to start from a place of positivity. Okay, next step, what are we going to do? How are we going to get out of this? What can we do? Who can I see? When can I do it? All of these things that will give you your boost of dopamine. We need to think about those things first. So start from a place of positivity and start with the right mental attitude. But doing that, we also need to be aware that our affective system is the most dominant. So our emotions will play their part. And some days you'll wake up and you'll feel lousy. You'll feel a little bit blah. Some days you'll feel happy and euphoric. But that's my third tip. If you wake up and you have those moments of feeling a little bit down or feeling a little bit, I can't be bothered today, then you know what? So what? You need to give yourself permission to accept that it's okay to not be okay. It really is. And the sooner you can kind of give yourself that permission to go, do you know what? I don't feel like I'm not in the right frame of mind today. That's fine. It really is fine, because given everything we've dealt with in the last 12 months, I mean, gosh, it's admirable if anybody's come through the last 12 months and they haven't had an emotional meltdown of sorts at some point, because it's been an absolute tumultuous time. It really has. Yes, there's been moments of light, shards of light, but there's been a lot of dark. So having those days of not being okay is, in my opinion, okay. But here is my final second but, shouldn't we say that? And it's a really important one, and it's this. It's also okay to be okay. You need to give yourself permission to accept if you're feeling fine. So when somebody says to you, I've had a terrible lockdown, I've felt down, I've felt lonely, it's been hard work, and you're thinking, I've been all right, then that's all right too. You know, we shouldn't be benchmarking ourselves or punishing ourselves. If you've had a pretty good last 12 months and your business has been successful and you still feel happy, you've liked the lockdown because it's given you time to develop as a person, etc., 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 because other people are having a worse time of it. Everybody, I'll say this phrase for the final time, everybody navigates the world in their own unique way. Some things that happen to some people will push them down, but the same thing could elevate another person. There is no right or wrong. There's just us trying to do the best we can with the hand that nature dealt us. And if that means you've navigated the last 12 months and you feel pretty chipper about the whole thing, then that's absolutely fine too. And we should be present, and we should take those precious moments that we kind of experience, and we should kind of bank them and use them to counter the kind of the darker days that we have and that we will have, which is just part of being a human being living a normal life. And so I'm going to finish with a quote. I always end my talks with a quote from somebody, and they're typically from this guy. This is a Swedish psychoanalyst called Carl Jung, who said some really poignant things for the time. He was like late 1800s, early 1900s. And he said lots of really poignant things, but he said this, which I think is really relevant to what we've been going through. And he said, we deem those happy who from the experiences of life have learned to bear its ills without being overcome by them. And that to me just sums up life generally, but it's equally relevant to what we've been through over the last 12 months with the pandemic. If we allow what we've been through to define who we are going forward, then there is a degree of us allowing that to overcome us. We need to look back at what we've been through, take the lessons from it, and use them to make us better people, but to give us a pathway that allows us to live the life that we want to live. I'm going to stop talking. I hope you found that useful. I'm going to hand back to Fiona while I have a sip of water. Any questions, I am completely happy to answer.
Well, Neil, that was absolutely fantastic. And I think it's so important that taking that time to reflect on the last 12 months. And the thing, I mean, I've heard you talk a couple of times on this topic, and it's recognising that collective trauma that we've been through, but everyone individually experiencing that in various different ways. It's huge. So just to take that time to reflect and learn and understand how we've approached it and how you've responded at times. And it's okay if you've had a bad day, but likewise, don't feel guilty if you've been okay at points. So
exactly right. Exactly right. And you know what I did a few months back as part of I do these now and again for myself. It's only I don't do it for anybody else other than me and my own personal growth, I guess, is I wanted to think, what have I been through in the last 12 months, really? So I sat down with a blank sheet of paper and a pen, good old fashioned way. And I started just to write things down and words that I knew I'd been through, you know, and when you start to look at it in black and white, you start going, God, I've been through a lot, actually, as in emotionally and just spiritually, I guess, maybe. And even kind of, you know, you think, and I'm going to dramatize this to make my point, you kind of think, yes, there's a global trauma going on, and there's death just outside my front door. There really is. There's like millions of people dying, and I'm hearing about it on the news every night. And when you think about it like this, and you start going, how would that have made me feel? Well, it would have made me feel scared, and it would have made me become biased in my thoughts, because my emotions then start to get triggered in quite a strong way. So then, therefore, I start to do things that would be classified, and I hate this word, even though I'm going to say it, would be classified as irrational. I don't believe there's irrational thinking, by the way, backed up by evidence. But it's kind of, you start to behave in a suboptimal way, because your emotions are there. So when you start writing things down, honestly, it's kind of like a slap in the chops. It's like, wow, that's a lot of stuff in 12 months. You know, I'm 46, and that's all happened to me in the last 12 months of my life. You know, for 45 years, I was all right, Jack, thank you very much. And here we have in the last 12 months, it's like, there you go, deal with that then. And coming out of it the other end, and, you know, I've had my dark days and I've had my light days, you know, like everybody has. But coming out of it the other end, I do kind of sit back and go, well done, Neil, you know, and Sandy, my wife, well done. Because actually navigating that mess to be happy and content still with our lives is a big thing. And it's very not British to kind of pat yourself on the back like this. But maybe we should take a leaf out of an American book. You know, I've got many friends, I work with an American company. They're amazing at kind of being self-congratulatory. And I love that about them. And we're not. And maybe we should. Maybe we should take the time to say, well done, and give ourselves a bit of slack and accept that what we've been through has been tough.
Yeah, absolutely. And one last thing before we can open up to everybody is, it's fascinating what you're saying there about Dr. Julia Shaw and what she's actually done. So I'm definitely going to put that on my reading list to find out a bit more about that as well.
It's scary. It's scary.
Great. Okay, so just opening up. Anyone get any comments, any questions for Neil?
I'll just jump in. Fiona, just while you were talking about Dr. Julia Shaw there, thought it was really fascinating what you were saying about the memories. Like, I feel like every time I try and recall something from when I was a child, I start the sentence with, I might be making this up. I'm sure this is what happened. So it's good to hear that that's actually normal. So that was fascinating.
And that's the point, Tracy. If we're being really, really honest with ourselves, you are making it up. Yes, these things did happen. Of course they did. And you know, there's a story I tell about, and this is God's honest truth. There's a story I tell about when I was about 8 and I was camping with my family, and a man walked out of the woods with a knife and opened a Mac and flashed at me, right? I swear, as I'm looking down the camera lens at you all here, that story is true. When I tell that in front of my sisters, they go, what are you talking about? That never happened. It did. You were all with me. That's not what happened. Well, what happened? And then when they tell me their story, I go, that's not what happened. And we end up in this kind of loggerheads of whose memory's true. And the reality is, as I start reading, this is a story I used to tell years ago, but as I've studied more and more around memory recall and the frailty of memory, I've started to realize, actually, do you know what? I should question these things. And maybe I should listen to my sisters when 3 of them, I've got 4 sisters, when 3 of my sisters are saying exactly the same thing. Neil, that's not what happened, mate. It was this. And I'm going, no, you're all wrong. Maybe I should listen to the 3 and go, okay, maybe. But actually, to your point, rewriting that memory for myself, it's almost impossible. Because it's there, you know, and it's so visceral. It's like, how do I get rid of it? And Julia Shaw says you can't. You know, you can retrain certain degrees of it, but you can't. You just need to realize when you recall it that it's not true. It's a fascinating book.